With the imminent release of Space Marine 2 in September, the obvious thing to do for any self-respecting video game channel is to cover the original, 2011's Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine by Relic Entertainment. Now, I was always going to cover this title at some point, because I'm a big fan of Warhammer games, and I'm a big fan of Relic Entertainment. After all, I made a very long video about Dawn of War Dark Crusade, and eventually plan on covering all of Relic's Dawn of War games in a series that who knows how many years is going to take me to make. I'm also a huge fanboy of all of Relic Entertainment's games. Well, the ones prior to 2014 at the least, and one day I'll probably cover all of them. And as a big fan of Warhammer video games in general, Space Marine seemed like an obvious choice to make a video about. The imminent release of Space Marine 2 just means I have a timely reason to do it. So, despite the risk of being lost in the crowd, I bit the bolt around and here we are. Space Marine is a very well received title. Not a 10 out of 10 masterpiece by anyone's measure, but a lot of solid 7 and 8s out of 10. It has kept a great reputation, hence this sequel being released more than a decade later. People have fond memories of this game. It has remained a solidly replayable title, even if in its age it is getting a bit ragged around the edges. Some games just don't need to be the cutting edge or the best there is, but merely need to deliver on the promise of what they are, their central pitch, to be a successful, well-loved title. Space Marine is legendary for depicting Warhammer 40,000 in a way that fans of the property had always dreamed of. Space Marine wasn't at the time of its release the market leader in ferocious, high spectacle, high energy, amazing third-person gameplay. It was released at the height of the Gears of War series, with the third entry in that franchise coming out a few weeks after Space Marine. And Gears of War remains an obvious touchstone and comparison point. If you aren't a Warhammer 40,000 fanboy, that is. Or if you divorce that from it and just think of it as an action game. It is a well-made title with some flaws, but nothing too gregarious. But also nothing too spectacular, though it has its moments. As a 40k game, it is a monumental love letter to that setting and universe, and as it is rather short, it would be no surprise to me if in 2011 a bunch of people, probably students between the ages of 15 and 25, found themselves introduced to and loving Warhammer 40,000 while waiting for Gears 3 to release. Drop a comment if that's you. Make no mistake, at the time, this was the most crystallized, complete, and accessible depiction of 40k in mass media. And while it has since been eclipsed in that regard, and the lore has moved on, it is still great at being an accessible romp through what it means to be a Space Marine in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Let's get the housekeeping stuff out of the way and talk about the boring first impression stuff. This game strikes me as a focused on the console platform kind of a game. While it was released for PC, it was clearly developed with the controller in mind first and adapted for the mouse and keyboard environment later. But I'll get to that in a moment. When you boot the game, you get a quick couple of titles and then a heroic Captain Titus. Chest out, chin up, pure, indefatigable, gallant concentration just gushing from his heavy brow. Just from this title screen, you get the impression you could bottle his sweat and sell it as liquid heroism. Warhammer's never been one for subtlety after all. Then you press that any key, and next comes a very small menu with full animations of Titus murderizing a bunch of orcs for the background. There is no mystery here for what this game is about. No sense of anticipation. Relic must have been extremely proud of these animations and basically designed the game around them as the central selling point, and they'd honestly be stupid to do anything but put them front and center in the marketing, the game, and hell, even the menu. If you were a 16-year-old boy back from footy practice and you'd never Warhammered a 40k before in your life, just booting this game up lets you know what it's all about before you even select new game. The menu only has 4 buttons: campaign, online, options, and credits. Credits is self-explanatory, I'm not going to go into it. I'm also not going to be checking out the online component of the game. So you need to look elsewhere for that. Sorry, but my mate back in the day swore by it and said it was awesome online multiplayer, and I'm inclined to believe him if that helps. That just leaves campaign and options. And like a good little PC gamer boy, I hit options first. As you can see now, when I first booted the game, the resolution needed adjusting because it was set to a 683 to 384 aspect ratio and a 1366 by 769 resolution. I'm not really sure why it defaulted to that, and I'm happy to let that be a mystery lost to time, but it goes without saying, even if I weren't the kind of gamer that must look at the options first, this resolution gaffe would have made me do it. So, other than fixing the resolution for my basic bitch native 1080p monitor, the options are also quite brief. Some gamma and brightness sliders, shadow and FX detail level and post-processing, VSync and ambient occlusion toggles. Aside from graphics, there's a gameplay options button, which mostly is settings for an Xbox controller, which is one of those hints I mentioned earlier that this is a console game first. Although this section does have options like mouse smoothing, look inversion, and horizontal and vertical sensitivity, if you like to mess with that stuff. The mouse and keyboard do get their own entire section in the options menu, however, and I wonder if that tab is even available on the Xbox. I mean, maybe. I vaguely recall they released mouse and keyboard for those things. I mean, didn't they? I don't know. I'm such an ignorant PC gamer boy. Anyway, this section is your obligatory key bindings, has a handy dandy function to disable the Windows key, and a nice reminder that when you see an orange skull icon, you can perform an execution and regain health, a core concept of the game. Finally, there are audio options too, but I didn't even look at them. I'm sure they are fine. Look, I usually love to have dense options in a PC game. The fact that this game is so sparse with them screams console release to me. But honestly, this game is such a self-contained little unit of a story, apart from a few tweaks, it really doesn't merit those kind of options. This isn't a technical strategy game or a Half-Life-esque platform for mods and PC gaming fuckery, where you want to press tilde to open the console and type commands. This game has one purpose: boot it up and then enjoy some interactive space violence. It has the basics, and that's all it needed. For once, I will praise the minimalism here. This game does not need options. The shortest amount of time between you and chainsorting some orcs is ideal. So you hit campaign and you get continue, new, and level select. You hit new and you get your difficulty. It's your classic Neapolitan ice cream flavors, easy, normal, and hard. So I went with the chocolate flavor naturally. Sorry, I mean the hard difficulty. Spoilers from here on out. Then we are treated to the opening cutscene, which sets up the premise of the game and gives us a little insight into Imperial technology. It's some kind of computer system, and it has identified that the Forge World Grya, if I'm saying that right, is under an orc invasion. It makes sure to let you know this Forge World produces titans, and that those are so important they cannot simply just blow the planet up or bombard it from orbit, which is standard practice in the Imperium. And they want to preserve the planet's capacity to produce said Titans. It concludes that sending a liberation fleet is a good idea, and goes ahead and dispatches one, but it also identifies that it is too slow and the problem needs a faster response. So, instead it decides to request help from the Codex Astartes, aka the Space Marines. Specifically, the Blue Boys and poster children of the Space Marines, the Ultramarines. With that out of the way, you see some spaceship wreckage floating in orbit, and the heroic Ultramarines descending on board their ship with the objective to secure the Titans. Then the game starts. It's a rather effective little cinematic that communicates a hell of a lot about the setting, with very little expensive animation or art assets, and a lot of very efficient little lines of text and jargon that sets up the plot and communicates the stakes well enough. Then we start with the in-engine gameplay cutscene, in media res. We have protagonist and player character Captain Titus and his boys aboard their ship discussing the situation. Their ship gets hit and Titus concludes that the ship should get out of there, while they use their jump packs and badass casual quips to complete their landing. Legendarily, one of the Marines says the famous Ultramarine meme line, "The Codex Astartes does not support this action," which Titus brushes aside with more suave action hero one-lining. For those that don't know, the Codex Astartes is like the Space Marine manual. Apart from this line being hilarious, it actually sets up a plot-important through line for the entire game. So it's absolutely essential that it is here right at the start. This game doesn't have the most spectacular of writing to it, because it just doesn't have scope for it. It's trying to tell what amounts to one of the most basic stories you can tell with Warhammer 40,000. However, they are very clever in how they go about doing this. They don't lose sight of the scope of what they are doing, and they pull off a basic premise with style and considered pace. Exactly what a game like this needs to do. Then you're off diving through exploding ships in the atmosphere like it's a regular Monday morning jog, and landing aboard an orc ship in the hero pose to triumphant music. Iron Man, eat your heart out. This is where the game relinquishes control over to you. Brief and effective, action-packed but also kinda stingy with it. This isn't like the Dawn of War intro, where the game has no hope of ever being quite as full of cool action. Sure, diving through the exploding ships is a bit of a spectacle, but there ain't no explicit enemies being shot, dramatic melee fights, or any other really cool shit. They are deliberately conservative with it, setting you up nicely for escalation of the stakes and action over the course of the game. The right call, I feel. This first orc ship you land on as Captain Titus is a tutorial on the gameplay, and serves as a character introduction for one of the main antagonists, Orc Warboss Grimskull. You use the ship's own big gun to shoot itself, and then you get a cool cinematic of the big ship crashing, only for Titus to crawl out of the wreckage, and bam! Heroic title screen. Yeah, this game is as subtle as a sledgehammer swung liberally in a crystal chandelier showroom. From this point, the actual game really starts. I'm not going to go through it all point for point. This game is short enough and old enough. If you haven't played it already and you really want to know, you may as well play it yourself. I'm going to jump around talking about the various aspects of the game. So, spoilers, but plot-wise, it's your typical, we're fighting the orcs because, orcs, that's what they exist for. But whoops, there's a traitor, turns out it's a chaos after all plot, which is Space Marine Story 101. The only thing it's missing is some haughty Eldar pretending that they were using the other factions for their own devices, but oh no, they lost control of the situation and had to run away. The plot does have a little kick to it, with a special glowing warp MacGuffin that actually continues to have plot relevance outside of this game as it turns up in Bolt Gun, which I've also made videos about. Go check them out. It's not an especially interesting or original story. It is, however, told as perfectly as this kind of story really could be, and it is exactly what it needs to be. Ideal for giving people who are new to Warhammer 40k the introduction that could get them started on their grim dark journey, and perfect for giving existing fans their jollies in their comfort zone. Everybody loves a classic done well. Excellent directorial vision in that regard. The game knows what it's doing and it is laser focused on it. Given the plot is so basic, it then gives room for a bit of character work to shine. And once again, these are some real archetypical Warhams characters. Ain't no expectation defying oddballs here. But the time you spend with them is used well and they play their roles to perfection. These characters do more than just act out the plot of the game. They have that all-important secondary role of being archetypes for Warhammer 40k in general. And by the time a newbie has finished this game, they have a damn good idea of how Space Marines, Orcs, Chaos Marines, Inquisitors, Imperial Guardsmen, and at least one Titan behave and interact in the setting. The characters here feature a bit like hero units in an actual Games Workshop codex. Little intertwining microcosmic examples of the baseline storytelling that the setting offers, whilst inferring the wider possibilities of the grimdank future that simultaneously stimulates your own creative ideas about what's going on. Almost like a template that you could use to tell a story in your own imagination. In telling their own tale and interacting with each other, they sketch the borders of the wider world and intrigue your imagination. And that's one of Warhammer's big strengths. Few other IPs have such a colossal wealth of world building and lore to draw upon, and even in this game's simplicity, its character writing gets to flex that strength. This could only come about because the people making the game love the setting and what they are doing, and B, Games Workshop loves to hook you into the rest of their shit with their existing shit as much as possible. It's a smart move all around. Passion, creativity, and business, all summed up by a main character with a chin so noble you could marry your daughter to it for political leverage. I know I'm not done talking about the plot and characters entirely, but that'll do for the moment. Let's talk about the level and environmental design. This is a game about set pieces. It's nothing but a chain of one big set piece after another. It's a bit of a masterclass in foreshadowing them as well, with the big gun on the horizon, or bridge, or spire that's important later, stretching off into infinity. Rarely does a skybox get used so well. This game paid attention to the lessons of Half-Life 2. These set pieces are almost characters unto themselves and have that same function of playing into the wider Warhammer 40k universe and constantly do their part in communicating the scale and nuances of the setting. When you see the big building that's also a big gun off in the background and then later get to crawl through its insides and push its shells the size of trucks around, it communicates something about the infrastructure of a society that is required to even be able to build such a thing, let alone plan and actually want to and need to build such a thing, only for it to be used against them by some cockney mushroom men. I can't possibly list them all. There are so many impressive set pieces in this game, but to rattle off a few, there's the already mentioned big gun building, giant bridge and orbital spire, but then there's also an air raid in Valkyrie ships where you hang out the side door and shoot down jetpack orcs. There's also a very orky train ride, a frozen boss fight MacGuffin holding chamber, Imperial Guard bunker fortifications complete with artillery, a big spinny MacGuffin energy blast laboratory contraption, a Titan you can ride on and plug the MacGuffin into for an extra spicy big boom, and a cameo from everyone's favourite chapter of Kleptomarines, the Blood Ravens. Not to mention all of the ruined buildings, sewers, trenches, and desert wastelands you can shake an uptight ultramarine at. So, on the macro level, the set pieces are very good and are the heart of this game. That's not to say they aren't without some flaws. There is an economy to the direction here, a clear need to save budget and time for the really big moments at the expense of the less big ones. So you get stuff like when you blow up the big gun building. So you load a shell into it that's got an explosive planted on it. And rather than getting a big detailed animation of the gun trying to fire it and then exploding, instead you just get your guys running doofily through some explosions and you just catch a glimpse of the cannon collapsing into the building. It's economic, it's just enough to convey the idea and present it well without actually having to pay for and animate detailed additional assets or cutscenes. The game's full of stuff like this, and in 2024 it can be a little lackluster and goofy, although it probably flew under the radar just fine in 2011. On the flip side of this, they pick their moments well when to actually do it properly. Mostly in the back half of the game, like when you ride on that Titan, it actually walks as you fight on it, and you do get a nice close-up detailed cutscene of its big gun obliterating the orbital spire, and then get to watch it continue to crack apart in the skybox during gameplay, which, old graphics aside, looks great even today. So they are a bit economic at the start of the game in exchange for getting the really spectacular moments right later. Now, on the other hand, on the micro level of the gameplay, the actual stomping around interaction of your character with the levels, well, it's some real basic shiz. It's very hard to get lost in this game. It's very hard to get stuck, which is good, but it's also pretty close to just being on rails without actually being on rails. The train sequence accepted, of course. There's a lot of waiting for lifts while you battle in arenas. Not a lot of chances to take forks in the road, and certainly no forks that lead to different outcomes. There's no exploration, no bonuses or secrets. There's nothing to this game but point-to-point seeing the sights, playing the set pieces. Now that we live in an era of open worlds and multiple endings, it might seem kind of quaint, but there's also a joyous simplicity. Shoot things, look for the big glowing green buttons next to doors, or interact symbols, move on to the next set piece. It's not complicated, it gets the job done. It's not a harsh criticism, it suits the goals of the game perfectly, but beware. In our spoiled modern context, this aspect does feel empty, and the game doesn't have anything else going on whatsoever. Well, except for these servo skulls you can pick up that are hidden, just barely hidden around the place. They are good old-fashioned audio logs, meant to add flavour and depth to the world, and toward the end of the game even explain a little bit of plot and character in regards to the Inquisitor. The truth is, these recordings are incredibly short, and having played System Shock Remake recently, they just aren't substantial or especially well written, and feel like a bit of an afterthought because they realised the levels were, well, kind of basic and empty. Compared to the amazing writing in System Shock Remake, these recordings barely even exist. I would not be surprised if this game had a very tight, controlled timetable and budget. They've done a lot here with what they've got, but there ain't no room for indulgent extras, and these audio logs are sparse and so brief, like you're lucky if you get 4 lines. Look, I'm aware that afterthought probably isn't the right word. It's hard to record a bunch of professional voice actors at the last minute and rush a feature out before publication. I mean, it's totally possible, but unlikely. It's clear in their planning, however, that this was either never meant to be a substantial feature, just a sprinkle of seasoning rather than a bottle of sauce, or it got cut down a lot to save time and money, and a heap is still on the editing room floor. Either way, I didn't collect them all. They just weren't interesting enough to bother. I'm sure if you cared to, it wouldn't be too challenging. I got most of them, and I wasn't even trying to. Before I said that the set pieces are the heart of the game. Well, the soul of the game is the combat. It's probably the first thing people think of when they remember Space Marine, and Relic knew that it was the very animus of their product, hence the background of the main menu, Titus demonstrating his divine ballet of violence on some orcs. Now, look, the combat is not perfect by any means. It has some flaws for sure. There are some notable games from the same era that definitely have more spectacular and influential combat than this one. Arkham Asylum was released 2 years earlier, and Arkham City in the same year. Dark Souls came out in 2011 as well, and of course the obvious, already mentioned, pivotal third-person action console series Gears of War. You could probably think of a few more. Feel free to comment some. But the point is, Space Marine is more of a B-movie to these A-list productions. Now, it is by no means bad, but it is definitely not the slick blockbuster when put alongside these all-time greats. Sure, there's some apples and oranges in these comparisons. I just want you to keep in mind that that is the context of the video game world Space Marine was created during and released into, as we talk about what's great about the combat, why it's well remembered, what's bad about it, and why it's getting a sequel. So, Space Marine is equal parts about ranged and melee combat, which actually kind of surprised me. I'd played it before many years ago, but for some reason I had only really remembered the melee combat, and as it's the main spectacle the devs put forward right there on the main menu, I'm sure I'm not the only one. Ranged combat is also central to this game, and it has many long sections that can't be tackled any other way, and even sections where you can choose to go melee, ranged, or both, that, at least on the hard difficulty I selected, appeared to be impossible to beat if you chose melee. While I put that discrepancy down to my difficulty selection, and I'll describe the situation in a little bit of detail later so you understand what I mean, I fully get why the game is doing what it's doing. There's two main reasons. One of them is that this is trying to bring the cinematic Warhammer 40,000 action of 2011 Used Dreams to the video game screen, and the second is just to provide a satisfying rhythm and variety to the gameplay. Remembering I'm a mouse and keyboard guy, so controller players might need to mentally translate my descriptions into controller bindings, the combat works like this. It's third person, and the mouse controls the camera. You aim with the mouse, shoot with left click like a first person shooter. Right click, you swing your melee weapon, of which there are several in the game. There are also some extra buttons that are either keyboard binds, or in my case, I assign them to my extra mouse buttons, and one of them performs an additional melee stun attack. Another throws grenades, and the last one zooms or scopes your ranged weapon. There's also a keyboard key for reloading, and another for activating the Emperor's Fury special ability, which makes you do extra damage in melee, regens your health, and gives you slow down time if you scope with a ranged weapon when it's activated. Some of these things you have to unlock through the game, however. It has a meter which fills up as you kill enemies and deal damage. Finally, if you stun an enemy with the stun move, or for some stronger enemies when they take enough damage, a little orange skull icon appears floating over them. And then you can press the use key to perform an execution, which gives you a cool kill animation, which regens a bunch of your health. You also have armor, which takes damage before your health does, and automatically regenerates if you stay out of danger and don't take damage for a little while. You can, for example, be almost dead in terms of health, but have full armor. Over the course of the game, your armor and your fury ability gets buffed, and the weapons you find get more and more deadly. The game has combos, and Titus has some small degree of automatic targeting in melee. So if you hit a direction and melee attack at the same time towards an enemy that's close enough, he kind of zooms over to them to make sure the hit connects. This means you can, to a degree, control who you are hitting in a group of enemies. There are also combos which are pretty simple, usually amounting to hitting the melee attack button between 1 and 4 times and adding in the stun key as the final press. These are so essential to being good at the combat that when you hit pause and bring up the menu, there is an entire screen you can open dedicated to making sure you know what the combos are and how to pull them off. And these aren't fighting game combos, relying on you memorizing crazy key combinations and pulling them off in high-stress scenarios with your epic skills. The game wants you to use combos all the time, wants you to have a nice low bar of entry to both the power fantasy of it and the cool animations they have worked so hard to make. Overall, this combat system is absolutely designed with one focus in mind: to deliver the experience of being an unstoppable power armor wearing badass, shooting and slicing your way through hordes of enemies, tough and weak. The only 2 ways to regen your health are either executions or the Fury super mode. Both require you to be in combat to use. Well, actually you can use the Fury ability anytime, but you fill up its meter by killing shit, so you can't just spam it for health whenever you want unless you are putting yourself out there to take damage. So the game primes you to be aggressive as much as possible, to have your shiny blue boy out there carving up mushroom men, getting blood everywhere and leaving smoking holes at demons. It is very effective at making you, the player, feel powerful, and it was, at the time, the absolute best depiction of a Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine in the midst of the nitty-gritty of what they do in combat that had ever been portrayed in media, and it remained the best depiction of this for quite a long time. This is the secret to why it's so well remembered and why it is so loved, this synchronicity between the depiction of the Space Marine in the lore and your imagination and what you actually get to play in the game. The truth is, it's not a particularly groundbreaking or sophisticated combat system outside of this, but the synthesis of it with the 40k lore and setting, along with the execution of the animations by the developers, makes for an exhilarating spectacle filled with gore, energy blasts, explosions, and bullets that, hey, even if all you are doing is clicking 1, 2, 3, and then hitting the F key on 4 over and over again in different directions, it's just the sheer kinetic, cinematic presentation of it, bringing a real goddamn Space Marine to life in front of your eyes, is the good stuff. And it's precisely why people remember it so well and want more of it in a sequel. Another big reason they might want a sequel is that the game just isn't very long and leaves you wanting more. But that's definitely a strength of this game. I don't think they could have sustained the set-piece parade and kept it interesting much longer than they did. Titus can carry 4 ranged weapons at a time in this game, but there are many more than that present, and many of them iconic weapons from the setting. You always have to carry 1 pistol weapon. In the early game, a bolt pistol, and later a plasma pistol, and you also have to always carry a bolter, the iconic Space Marine weapon, which in the late game gets upgraded to Kraken Bolt ammunition. These take your first 2 weapon slots all the time. The other 2 slots you can pick and choose amongst the arsenal of weapons the game has on offer, including the Stalker Bolter, which is a kind of sniper rifle, the Melter Gun, which is a kind of super shotgun, a las cannon, a kind of super sniper rifle, the Vengeance Launcher, a cross between a rocket launcher and a grenade launcher, and the Plasma Gun, which you can charge shot by holding down fire, and finally the Storm Bolter, which is basically just a mega rapid fire bolter. These ranged weapons can be found lying around the map, at first in drop pods specially deployed for you to find, that scan you and open up when they confirm you are a bona fide Space Marine. But later on you just find like whole shipping crates of the things just lying haphazardly everywhere every single time you're about to wade into a major gameplay arena or section. You can select which ranged weapons you are using by hitting the 1 to 4 keys, and because the UI pops up with them in a D-pad-like configuration as you select them, I can only assume you use the 4 directions on the D-pad on your game controller, if you are playing it that way. That's another dead giveaway from the UI that this game is a console title first, PC title second. Even if you switch to a big 2-handed weapon like, say, the las cannon, you can use melee. The weapon just instantly disappears out of your hands and you slash with your melee weapon, pistol or one-handing the bolter in the offhand. They appear instantly in your hands when selected as well. This is some video game shorthand. Space Marines don't canonically have hammer dimension weapons, and admirably, the game is rather light on these kind of video game logic concessions, and tries hard in most cases to depict Space Marines fairly accurate to the lore descriptions of them. It's one of the great appeals of the game, but carrying multiple large ranged weapons and simultaneously being able to use melee was obviously a bridge too far and needed to be included for the rule of fun. There are also heavy ranged weapons which can be found mounted on tripods at various points throughout the map and include things like the heavy bolter and plasma cannon. You can even tear them off their mountings and walk around shooting them because you're a giant 8-foot tall power armoured killing machine, but they are implied to be much larger and heavier than the other weapons because you cannot switch weapons or use melee while you are using them and your movement is slowed. Although you can drop them at any time if you need to slash at some gits. There's also a variety of melee weapons in the game, although you can only have one at a time. You start with a knife, then you get a chainsword, then a power axe, and finally a thunderhammer. You actually get given the choice at many times throughout the game to choose between them, so it's not necessarily a case of any one being better than the other. Well, okay, I'll be real. The knife barely appears in the game after the first level, and the thunderhammer is obviously the most powerful, but it has a drawback in that it is such a large 2-handed weapon that you cannot use ranged weaponry at all if you pick it up. As a result, the thunderhammer often has sections of the game kind of dedicated just to it, and most of the game you are making a choice between the power axe and the chainsword. Of the two, I preferred the power axe, but you could use either. I really loved using the thunderhammer, but as I said earlier, the few times the game gives you the choice of taking it or using ranged weapons, I kept on finding myself getting murderized by powerful ranged opponents before I could get close enough to even use it. I believe that on easier difficulties this probably wouldn't happen as much, but on hard you die extremely quickly if you take even a handful of hits, and you just can't tank the damage to get close enough with the thunderhammer in some scenarios. There's a particular enemy unit, a kind of chaos cultist sorcerer type dealio that hovers stationary with warp energy all around them, and they shoot giant beams of energy at you. These guys kill you so fast, and there's basically no way to close in on them without getting hit for melee attacks, and especially if there's multiple of them and a bunch of other enemy troops attacking you, and hint, there's always enemy troops when these guys show up. Maybe you can tank the damage and get close to them on easier difficulties, but on hard I found the only effective way to deal with them was to snipe them from distant cover with the las cannon or stalker bolter first, and then run out and engage other enemies in melee. This illustrates one of the weaknesses of the combat in Space Marine. There is a bit of tension going on between the melee and ranged. They aren't entirely complementary of each other, and in general the combat system has some flaws that put it at odds with itself. Now, don't get me wrong here, the system is still great enough to be the centerpiece of the game and be so well remembered. The game would be a lot poorer without the ranged shootout sections, say where you snipe orcs out of ruined buildings or mow them down across trenches with a heavy bolter, but also sometimes it seemed to me it was trying to say, hey, now you've played a bunch and you understand the game, you are free to play it and deal with these situations any way you like. So here's all of the guns and melee weapons in a crate, pick up your loadout and go nuts. Only for it to be basically impossible to win with the Thunderhammer, for example, or for one ranged weapon or another to be the right answer to the upcoming situation. It's fine for the game to do both, and do both well, but sometimes you feel almost soft-locked by your decision to choose one or the other and have to restart from a checkpoint and use a different loadout to progress. Another way in which it doesn't quite seem to be in synergy with itself is the executions. Don't get me wrong, the executions are absolutely the coolest part of the game, and they are fantastic animations and are well loved for a very good reason. But give me a moment to explain. The idea of using a special move to stun an enemy and then getting a cool execution animation on them to restore health is a good one. It encourages you to be aggressive and shows off the coolest shit in the game, and ideally keeps you in the flow of combat, excitement, and maximum entertainment the game has to offer, even once you are hurt and would have to withdraw in a different title. Except, the thing is, you still take damage when you are performing an execution. Now, this in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. Other games that have used this system make you invulnerable while you perform an execution animation, and I'm fine with the challenge of you still taking damage when you do one. It's a valid choice for the dev to make. The problem comes with the fact that the animation is long, and you are locked into it once you start it. So what happens is, you are in a hectic melee with a group of orcs, you are on low HP, about to die, so you perform an execution like the game encourages you to get your health back and keep the rhythm of the game going. And some orc that just walked in the room shoots you while you're doing it and you die halfway through the animation. So you actually quickly learn that you need to withdraw from combat altogether and go hide in cover to regen your armor when you are hurt, and that to heal you need to isolate an enemy by themselves, usually towards the end of a fight when you actually have the time and room to perform the execution without it being a guaranteed death sentence for Titus. Now, I like the idea of taking damage while you perform an execution. It's realistic. Why should you be magically invulnerable while you do them? But do you see how it is kind of problematic? It kills all the rhythm and momentum of a hectic melee encounter, and it kind of makes you ask, why even have executions restore health at all, if they aren't designed to keep you in the fight? There's no challenge to isolating a single target when there aren't any others left to get some health back. You might as well just have a medkit button. Now, obviously, one way to solve this is just to make you invulnerable while you do them. But another way would be just to allow you to interrupt it and go seek cover if you realize you are being shot. That's not a great solution, but it would go a long way to avoiding the feelings of frustration and powerlessness that derive from the lack of control you have over your death whenever this happens to you. It feels unfair. I mean, yeah, you initiated it, it's your fault, but it feels like control is taken away from you just so you can watch your character die. If you could abort the maneuver and try to dodge at least, you wouldn't feel that way so much. Now, an even better solution would be to have two kinds of execution. Maybe a tap the button once for a light execution and a hold it down for a heavy one. A light execution has a really fast animation, say one that takes only a second, but at the same time only has a small health gain. This would allow you, in the middle of a hectic fight, to retain your momentum when your HP gets low. You get hurt in the middle of a crowded fight, you use a combo that knocks enemies back, stun one, use an execution, 1 second, bam, you've cut their head off and gotten a little bit of health. This way you take minimal risk in locking you into that animation while you take damage, get to stay in the fight, preserve the momentum and rhythm of combat, and maybe even chain a bunch of them together to get your health back. Hell, if they were really clever, you could maybe get combo scores and extra bonuses for chaining them together. Then, when you only have that one enemy left, you still have the big, impressive, heavy execution animations available to you to show off the coolest shit the game has and get that big health recovery for the next encounter. It's just my 2 cents on it, but this really was one of the weakest, most frustrating and annoying aspects of the game for me, and the fact that it came ensconced within one of the coolest, strongest central mechanics of the game really was very disappointing, and my biggest hope for Space Marine 2 is that they have addressed this somehow. Maybe they have an even better idea than I do. I'm quite happy if they do. The other thing about the executions, and maybe this is a 2011 technical limitation thing, but they also often did not play well with the collision and clipping of the game world, and I frequently encountered jank where if you started an execution animation too close to a wall or a pillar, you would clip halfway through it in the middle of the animation, and Titus would end up sawing an orc in half in the void outside of map bounds, or magically halfway off the edge of the cliff in mid-air as if you were on some invisible platform. I sincerely hope in Space Marine 2 that if you perform an execution near a wall, Titus slams the enemy into that wall. If you perform one near an edge, Titus kicks that enemy off that edge into a massive drop, and similar environmentally contextual animations. Now, I will obviously give the game the benefit of the doubt. It was made 13 years ago, so I won't call that a criticism, and I'll put it down to the limits of old school technology. But Space Marine 2 absolutely needs to, at the very least, have collision you bounce off so the visual jank of nonsensical clipping doesn't occur so frequently. One more criticism of the combat I had is for a third-person action game that was released post 2 Gears of War titles, you would think that they'd have some sort of interactive cover system in the game. Unfortunately, there's nothing of the sort, and the inherent awkwardness of a third-person camera and trying to use cover effectively can come into play, resulting in you thinking you are behind cover, but actually that orc over there has an angle on a bit of you that's sticking out. Or there's actually an enemy obscured from your point of view by your character model or the angle of your third-person camera. Space Marine 2, I hope, has some kind of active cover system to assist with this, as has long been the standard for third-person shooters in a post-Gears of War world. There is one more cool thing with the combat that comes up, and that's the jump pack. You only get it for very deliberate sections of the game, but I think they are the very best bits the game has to offer. The jump pack is a simple enough thing to use, but it's heaps of fun. Basically, you can rocket up into the air, target anywhere on the ground, and then rocket down into a ground pound and perform a giant slam attack that knocks back and stuns enemies, giving you the perfect way to jump into melee engagements, dodge, and close in on dangerous ranged opponents fast, and feel badass as fuck. It also provides a much speedier freedom to the game's movement, which feels fantastic, and jumping out of danger basically gives you a get out of jail free card whenever you are about to die, and even on hard difficulties it feels overpowered. Hence why it is only available for short sections in the game. Also, the levels and environments needed to be specially designed to be able to cope with it without you clipping out of the map and ending up in the void or messing about in the skybox, which, despite the issues with the executions, actually never happened to me with the jump pack, even though the potential for it seems a lot higher. Hell, while I'm talking about it, the game is actually extremely stable for an old title, and in general ran very well, booted and loaded quickly, and never crashed once, so that's fantastic. The jump pack was definitely for me the highlight of the entire game, or at least the gameplay part of the game, and it's the pinnacle of the combat system. You never really feel as powerful as you do as when you've got the Thunder Hammer and you are jetting about slamming it into groups of enemies. Space Marine 2 would do very well to expand on this aspect of the game and make it more involved, taking full advantage of what modern tech has to offer, and hopefully a more open plan kind of level design and game world. The game has a few boss fights throughout it, and to be honest, with the exception of the mini-boss encounter with the weird boy where you were using the jump pack, they are all pretty lame. Lame bosses has long plagued video games, and don't get me wrong, in this one it's not the character of the boss antagonists that's the problem. What they diegetically represent is really well done and really cool. No, the problem is the gameplay of the boss fights is some super generic cookie cutter shit, which is fine. The game didn't need to be innovative in this regard. It's good enough, it delivers what it needs to deliver. But it is a shame that the boss fights couldn't be real tests of your skill with the combat system, and instead are, in one instance, dodge the guy and shoot him in the weak point, and the final boss amounts to a goddamn quick time event. This is probably one of the most criticised parts of the entire game. That final sequence really could have been a cutscene, and mercifully, it is the only quick time sequence in the entire game, so I do credit them for their incredibly select use of the quick time sequence. It's hard to be mad about it being used once at the end for the big climactic set piece, but a real boss fight would have been way cooler, especially against a character who could maybe engage with the combat system similarly to the way you do, perhaps a bit like the Bloodletters or Slugger Knobs, but more so. This is one thing I also expect Space Marine 2 must tackle and improve upon. I will be very disappointed if the sequel leans on quick time events, especially for the defeat of highly anticipated boss moments. As it stands in Space Marine, it makes it feel like Titus has defeated the big bad evil boss dude Nemeroth, but the player hasn't. The players just press some buttons for the privilege of watching Titus beat Nemeroth. And that's lame, and it goes against the empowering gameplay rule that the rest of the game has thrived on. A cutscene still would have been great, but it would have been better than a quick time event. If you're going to just show us a sequence, show us a sequence. Go full ham. Don't make it a press a button to see the next bit of the sequence. Those things are lame. Something else that's really nifty about this game is that for large sections of it, you have allies fighting alongside you. This is both great for selling the cinematic lore depiction of the Space Marines, as they usually work together as a team and not as lone one-man army types, and it's great for the gameplay. It's nice to have some help in a hard fight. The AI isn't especially fancy, but it isn't annoying either. I don't think even once I felt blocked by friendly AI. There is some incongruency as they seem to be invulnerable when you aren't, which is a fairly typical way for games to handle friendlies, but It is kind of funny when your plot-armoured main hero character dies every 5 minutes to the slightest gunshot, and Nameless Marine number 7 can tank endless grenades to the face. The allied AIs are mostly made up by the 2 other Ultramarine characters you meet at the start of the game, but we'll get back to them. What was really cool was the presence of the regular mooks in the form of the Imperial Guard, who definitely aren't invulnerable, and later the aforementioned Blood Ravens chapter of Space Marines, who show up briefly, and also, finally, there's even a short non-gameplay cameo for the Black Templars chapter. This is another very smart move by the developers, going out of their way to show you more of the Warhammer world. I'm sure the moment when the guardsmen first set eyes on you and make comments about how they never thought they'd live to see an actual Space Marine, while you literally tower over them and reassure them you've got the situation handled, has stuck with many a player. That's the sort of shit that gives you a glimpse into what it's like for a regular person to be in this situation, what Space Marines look like to regular people, almost godlike in their stature. And it does heaps of heavy lifting, illustrating the relationships in the setting and providing further glimpses into the wider world of 40k. The later Bloodraven encounter is one of the coolest parts of the entire game, not just because it's awesome to have Relic's very own chapter invented for Dawn of War show up here, but because you actually get to advance in a combat zone with a full squad of Space Marines covering one another in a hectic battle. It makes it really feel like you are in 40k. Not to mention, it does more legwork demonstrating the way Space Marine chapters interact with one another and dropping more hints about the larger interconnected nature of the Imperium. On the other hand, having 2 enemy factions in the game also does this and makes up some of the other more exhilarating and thrilling parts of the game. So, at a crucial point, about halfway through the game, you put your warp MacGuffin into a device at the behest of Inquisitor Drogon, who you met earlier. He tells you it will kill off the invading Orc horde, but instead, the device opens a warp portal and summons chaos to the planet. Big End boss Nemeroth steps out, some stuff happens, the Inquisitor dies, but crucially, before Nemeroth can kill you, the Orc war boss Grimskull tackles him off a cliff, and they disappear while fighting. From that moment on, you get this awesome 3-sided war zone, where Orcs, Chaos, and Imperium are all battling each other simultaneously. That is, until a bit later when you kill Grimskull, and that instantly ends the Orc threat, and they are never really seen again. I think that was a bit of a shame, as the warzone feeling of that section of the game is incredibly compelling, and it is infinitely satisfying to watch your 2 enemies duke it out with each other while you take advantage of the situation. Once again, it also gives you that extra lore kick, where you see how Chaos and Orcs interact, and that even though Chaos is the bigger, scarier threat to you, that's not necessarily the case for the Orcs. After all, you see Grimskull and Nemeroth fighting, but you never see the outcome of that fight, and you are the one that kills both of them. They do not best each other. Chaos, after all, is such a threat to Imperials because it corrupts them, it tempts them and transforms them and takes them over, like it did to Inquisitor Drogon. It is a major theme for most Space Marine chapters and stories. Space Marines are always tripping over themselves at breakfast and falling to chaos, and being all noble and honourable and puritanical is an important part of their characterization, in contrast to the indulgent, cackling evil of chaos that they are tempted to fall to. The Orcs don't really have this problem. They are already obsessed with fighting, absolutely anybody and anything, all of the time, including themselves, and they already have their own gods, who are totally on board with this. Chaos doesn't really have any noble ideology to corrupt with them, or beliefs or worldviews to twist. It's kind of like trying to convince a dog to side with your political ideology when all it cares about is chasing ball and getting belly rubs. It just fundamentally doesn't experience the world on a level where politics exists. And similarly, orcs just fundamentally don't experience a world where chaos is anything other than another heavily armed and very spiky foe to fight. No different from the Imperials they are already fighting. Well, except for the spikes. So, it's very cool to see them duking it out and how it reveals the way the two factions interact with each other. Now, I'm not quite sure if Chaos meant to have the Orcs invade the Forge world so they could soften it up and trick the Imperium into opening the warp portal and letting Chaos invade, or if it was just a coincidence. Most definitely, through Inquisitor Drogon, Chaos had been working on invading the planet long before the Orc invasion started. It is revealed in dialogue between Titus and his squad mates that at some point between Inquisitor Drogon sending out the distress signal asking for help against the Orc invasion and you actually meeting him, he has been killed and replaced by an agent of Chaos that wears his skin to trick you. There's also some of those Servo Skull audio logs that reveal Drogon talking with this Chaos demon prior to his death at its hands, and this obviously must take place before the Orc invasion starts. Turns out, messing with strange warp artifacts was bound to attract this kind of attention at some point, and there's probably an argument to be made that even before he was killed by Chaos and had his skin puppeted about, he was a traitor for even messing with the warp artifact so much in the first place. He's a member of the Ordo-Xenos arm of the Inquisition, which means he's dedicated to eradicating aliens. And he was messing with the artifact because he thought he could use it to build the ultimate alien-killing weapon. But instead he builds the Chaos Portal opening device that you activate unknowingly during this game. Possibly his initial messing with the device to attune it to kill orcs actually attracts them to invade. Maybe Chaos deliberately manipulated the orcs to attack the world. Maybe it was just some total coincidence. But the point is that Chaos and orcs are not some homogeneous threat to man in 40k, but distinct factions quite happy to war with one another as easily as you war with them. And this game gets it across in an exhilarating way. Honestly, the moment Grimskull tackles Nemeroth might be my favourite moment in the entire game. Okay, let's talk about the main cast of characters now. 3 Space Marines and a supporting actress in the leader of the Guardsmen, Lieutenant Mira. We've already spoken on Drogon, Nemeroth and Grimskull. So, your 2 main squad mates are Sidonus and Leandros. Sidonus is a grizzled old veteran who clearly respects the hell out of the player character Captain Titus and trusts him implicitly. Leandros, on the other hand, is some kind of newbie who clearly has a lot of internal conflict playing out between what he's been taught and what his superior officer is doing. Now, Leandros is famously loathed by people who play this game. And I admit, until this most recent playthrough for this video, I really didn't like him either. So, spoilers, but Leandros is mighty suspicious of Captain Titus because he clearly has some kind of warp fuckery going on. Titus literally grabs the warp MacGuffin with his bare hands at one point and is able to resist Nemeroth's chaos sorcery powers when everyone else is helpless against them, and ultimately you're the one that plugged the MacGuffin into the device and opened the warp portal. Now, from your perspective playing the game, this is just Titus being a classic plot-armored hero doing classic exceptional heroic shit, and it seems Sidonus's role in the game is very much to have this point of view as well. Implicitly playing the I've been around enough and seen enough shit and had Titus as my superior officer long enough that I will literally walk through hell with him and still do anything he says without question. But Leandros, fresh from Space Marine school, is constantly in a state of, wait a second, they taught us that literally walking through hell is something demons do, and you probably shouldn't just do everything they say. On one hand, You could easily explain Titus's feats as blessings and interventions by the Emperor. His deeds are holy and he's a big fancy golden glowing chosen one hero type, which most definitely pop up in Warhammer. On the other hand, Drogon is evidence that when you mess with the warp messes with you, and the results are almost always heretical. Lieutenant Mira has an important role to play as the, air quotes, innocent human representative. She herself is a hero who has managed to command the last dregs of the surviving guardsmen on the planet, but in terms of the way the story plays out on a character level, her role is more importantly to be the symbol of humanity that Titus is fighting to protect. She is the embodiment of the courage of regular humans, trying to make do in an awful universe full of things trying to kill them, not some kind of superpowered demigod-like being like every other major character is. So, running through the whole game is this subplot with Leandros calling Titus out for being all suspiciously warp-powered and not doing things by the Codex, and Sidonus telling him to chill out, and Titus trying to concentrate on the task at hand and save the damn planet, which is summed up and embodied by Lieutenant Mira and everything she represents. There comes an important turning point in the story where you give the warp MacGuffin to Sidonus so he can evacuate it off-world and the Ultramarines can investigate it and deal with it later while Titus concentrates on saving the planet, only for Nemeroth to immediately teleport in and kill Sidonus and take the warp doohickey. Cue tragic no moment. I will get revenge from Titus. So, after you beat Nemeroth at the end of the game in that awful quick time event, you get an epilogue where a new Inquisitor named Thrax turns up with a bunch of Black Templar Space Marines in escort, and you find out that Leandros has reported Titus to the Inquisition as corrupted by chaos. Titus is obviously pretty pissed about this, and the player is too, but the Inquisitor threatens to get all medieval on Lieutenant Mira and the Guardsmen and your fellow Ultramarines as co-conspirators to Titus, which bristles against Titus's hero instincts, and he must sacrifice himself to protect them. So he submits to Inquisitor Thrax, although not before delivering one final badass one-liner dressing down of Leandros for being a goody two-shoes dibby-dobbying little bitch. Notably, Thrax does not force Titus to put his weapons down or handcuff him or subdue him or anything like that at all, which does bode well for Thrax maybe already having come to that Emperor's Holy Intervention conclusion in regards to Titus's weird warp resistance, but that is just an assumption of mine. And with that cliffhanger, that's where the game ends. As mentioned before, because of this, Leandros has gone down in history for fans as being a whiny, treacherous rat that everybody hates. And I mentioned before I was completely with this point of view until this playthrough. Now, I have a whole new appreciation for him and what's going on here. He's a masterful directorial stroke of storytelling, and without him, Titus and the story of Space Marine would be one of the most cookie-cutter boring hero saves the day power fantasy stories ever put in a video game. But more than that, if you are a little into 40k lore and storytelling, Leandros' point of view and actions aren't just understandable, they are downright sensible and also outright typical for 40k. He's like the only guy who notices Titus is on fire and grabs an extinguisher. Given just how often in 40k big important Space Marines get a little involved with the warp and then turn into maniacal, cackling, betentacled, spiky demon men overnight, Leandros would be a fool not to get the Inquisition involved. After all, if it turns out Leandros is wrong, then the Inquisition might figure that out and let him go. Although, if you know anything about the Inquisition, that seems unlikely. But if it turns out Leandros is right, then he's saved a whole company of the Ultramarines from a fate worse than death. While from the perspective of you, the player, or from Sidonis or even Lieutenant Mirror, it might be obvious Titus isn't a chaos-inflicted heretic, the lack of spikes gives it away after all, but from Leandros' point of view, it is pretty damn likely he is. All evidence points to yes, and if he's as much of a by-the-book goody two-shoes as he appears to be, he won't be especially cynical about the Inquisition, and will probably say something like, "If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear." Now, this little twist serves the story in so many ways. It's great for showing more of the wider world of 40k. For someone new to it, this moment is a big hook to find out more off your own back. After all, the big hero man won, and now he's a prisoner of the side that he won the day for? Why? But more than that, it provides a conflicting point of view throughout the whole story. Leandros provides an ever-present doubt over Titus's actions that you might not agree with, but by its very presence suggests that things could be done differently, that there is more to this world and this story than on the surface, and that 40k isn't a simple place where big armoured heroes just save the day by doing brave, courageous things. Remember, Drogon is right there in the story too, proving that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. The game is so much better for having this plot in it, and it's a great ending that sets the game up for a sequel and doubles down on Titus's heroism. Even in the face of intimate betrayal, at the moment of triumph, he's still got that chin held high, and he's still willing to sacrifice himself for others. Of course, it has been so bloody long since this game was made, and the actual 40k lore has moved on so much. I'm pretty much certain that whatever they originally had planned with this ending for a sequel isn't what we're going to get in Space Marine 2. I'm sure it'll be addressed and explained, but yeah, we're not getting a game that picks up immediately after this one left off, given that Titus is an Ultramarine, and boy has a lot changed for the Ultramarines in the last 13 years. I'm certain Games Workshop will not be interested in a game released in 2024 representing the lore as it was in 2011. I'm not going to dive too much into that side of things. You can look that up yourself if you don't already know about it. But Games Workshop are going to want to represent the setting and the miniatures and the hobby as it is now. Not to mention that these days 40k has just so much more media presence in terms of shows and games than it used to. Space Marine 2 need not tell such a basic story, as the general public, gaming or otherwise, is far more across 40k and what it is about than they used to be. Still, I am very excited to find out what happens with Titus and Leandros and the Inquisition, and it is so much cooler for there to be some twisty, murky beef there to explore, rather than have a simple "Hero saves the day, tune in for more heroic day saving next week." One last thing about the characters in this game, and that's their models. They are awesome. In general, the 3D character models in this game are a huge standout, and despite the dated graphics making them look a bit shabby, the actual 3D models are great, especially the Chaos Space Marine models. Later in the game, those are magnificent. They have so much cool detail on them. And Nemeroth himself, man, he is probably the single coolest 3D model ever made back in 2011. He is so good, the graphics don't even look dated on him. He is sharp and a truly awe-inspiring character model, just overflowing with opulent details. You could stare at him in motion for, I don't know, at least half the game and be quite happy with it. And on top of that, the voice acting for all the characters is also fantastic. Convincing and appropriate casting all around. Warboss Grimskull in particular is a standout for his voice, the way he bellows the words "Space Marine" with contempt or boasts about not being easy to kill. It just deserves the kiss of the chef. This is a game where the sound design is better than the music. It's not my favourite sounding bolter or depiction of a bolter in video games, but it's not bad either. It's pretty good. It's in the high tier. In general, everything sounds great. The weapons are really brought to life by the sound work, and nothing feels out of place. You'll hear explosions, engines roaring to life, gigantic energy blasts, chainsaws ripping through flesh, and all that goodness. And also, it's useful for gameplay. You can pick weapons out by their sounds, you can pick mobs out by their sounds. It's got all that typical gameplay utility as well. The music, though, is incredibly generic. It does its job: a heroic swell on cue, an ominous droning when there's tension, low tribal drums for battle music, that sort of thing. It's a perfectly serviceable soundtrack and ticks every box it needs to, but you aren't going to be humming any of these tracks. You aren't going to be listening to the soundtrack in your free time. This is music doing its day job, not letting its hair down and strutting its stuff. It's competent but forgettable. Sure, I'd rather that than bad or inappropriate music. The composer or director isn't being criticised here, but so often great games have exceptional music that stands on its own, and this just isn't that. This is generic video game soundtrack number 98, and that's fine, but, fingers crossed, maybe Space Marine 2 will have a banger of a soundtrack? I mean, I'll settle for at least this level of quality, but go on, that'd be pretty cool, right? I played this game right after playing the new Bolt Gun DLC, Forges of Destruction, and damn does Bolt Gun have some great music. That's really moody and gives it a great sense of identity, whereas Space Marine really just hits the expected notes it needs to hit. There's a big difference there. Playing Bolt Gun so close to this also makes it an obvious comparison point in general. After all, they do share the same planet for their setting. They have the same warp MacGuffin in the plot, and they are both about a heroic ultramarine. Bolt Gun makes it obvious that even though Titus kills Nemiroff, that Grya falls to chaos at some point down the track anyway. Bolt Gun's gameplay is way snappier, way more direct, and I honestly much prefer it. It's a fundamentally much more fun, challenging, player-centric style of gameplay. But Space Marine is a much better depiction of Warhammer 40,000 and Space Marines and how they actually behave, how they actually fight, what their job is and their role in the Imperium, and the challenges and obstacles they face. Bolt Gun is a video game wearing Warhammer 40k skin on top. Space Marine is a Warhammer 40,000 story that happens to be told via the video game medium, and that, I think, is the secret to its success and its longevity, and why it is getting a sequel. This attitude, where the 40k setting and stories it can tell are used as the basis from which the video game and gameplay is developed to depict it, rather than trying to drape an existing game format in 40k pageantry as so many 40k games are, it works wonders for creating positive feelings in the player that connects them to the characters and creates great memories and inspires nostalgia for the setting in the game. Something like Bolt Gun creates positive feelings about the exciting gameplay sessions, but it doesn't leave your imagination with much to work with in terms of the actual world. It's more of a time-killing stress reliever than a story. You get a much better impression of Grya as a Forge world and the kind of universe the Imperium and 40k is from Space Marine, and it is over a decade older than Bolt Gun. It's great our world has room for both games, of course. These aren't criticisms of one or the other, but merely an interesting contrast between two games at different ends of the scale. I want instant action, bang bang frenetic shooty times, I play Bolt Gun. I want to know what it feels like to be on a Forge world liberating it from an orc invasion. I want to know how Ultramarines work together. I play Space Marine. In conclusion, Space Marine is a classic Warhammer 40k video game, although it perhaps doesn't quite scrape into the all-time great regular video game category. I think all of its best qualities are so intimately tied up with 40k that in 2024 it doesn't really have much to offer someone who isn't interested in 40k. There are just so many great classic games out there, many of them from 2011. The only reason you might want to play it is because of the upcoming sequel if you aren't a huge 40k fanboy. However, if you are into 40k, then Space Marine is an absolutely unmissable title, especially for a newbie who's curious or someone who doesn't know 40k yet but would like to. Sure, it's out of date lore-wise, but that doesn't matter. It's still a great starting point, and I wouldn't be surprised if the double whammy of Space Marine and then Space Marine 2 nets Games Workshop a whole bunch of new fans to buy miniatures, video games, animations, and, watch the hotly anticipated Amazon streaming series with what's-his-name actor McActorface. A very competent video game title with some flaws, but an absolute treat for fans that has an aura of positive nostalgia for good reasons. It's only short. I thoroughly recommend giving it a run before Space Marine 2 comes out. You'll knock it over in a couple of days. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. Soaring hammer crashing down, howling greenskins strewn around, blood and fire, snot and brain, the captain's descent, the orcish bane. Yet yonder threat, the dark sunrise, upon the wind, shrill demon cries. The captain moves, his convictions stern, to see his will, the fury yearns. The hammer rises into the air. By the Emperor, none shall dare to stand before his holy light. We are his justice, we are his might.